Circle 8.
Circle 8.
Circle 8.
Welcome to Circle 8. Psychoanalytic theory. History. Psychoanalytic theory is the cornerstone and the foundation of modern counseling and psychotherapy. Of several hundred different therapies in use today, most of them have derived some fundamental formulation, technique, or impetus from the psychoanalytic system. Henrik, 1980. Therefore, this survey of theories and strategies in counseling and psychotherapy begins with a brief overview of psychoanalytic theory from those of its founder, Sigmund Freud, to those of current practitioners. Freud was born in Freiburg, Moravia in 1856 and died in London, England in 1939. Freud grew up in a time of great scientific progress, which was instrumental in influencing the development of Freudian thought in psychology. For example, one of the most important scientific works to this time was The Origin of the Species by Darwin. Darwin's idea that a human was an animal amongst other animals and thus could be studied naturalistically was a foundation for Freud's study of the workings of the human mind. In 1860, Gustav Fechner found the discipline of psychology, taking the place among other sciences. The new discipline made human behavior a subject of scientific study. A third major influence came from the field of physics. Hermann von Helmholtz proposed the idea of the person as an energy system that obeys the same physical laws of other matter. This conception of people led to Freud's development of the idea that human motivation was influenced by unconscious sources of energy. Arlo, 1979, Fancher, 1973. In pursuit of his goal to become a scientist, Freud entered medical school at the age of 17 and was strongly influenced by Ernst Bruch, a prominent psychologist of the 19th century. Bruch's influence on Freud ultimately led some 20 years later to the creation of a dynamic psychology which involved the study of the transformations and exchanges of energy within the personality. For about 15 years after Freud entered medical school, he studied the nervous system and earned a reputation as a promising young neurologist. However, because of financial reasons and an inability to secure a university appointment, he was forced to give up his research pursuits to practice medicine. Hall, 1954, Jones, 1953. In his medical practice, Freud specialized in nervous disorders and sought to find out how to treat them. He first studied in France with Jean Charcot, who used hypnosis to treat hysteria and other disorders. Hypnosis became a key component of his practice. However, he became dissatisfied with it because of its instability of results and because some of his clients could not be hypnotized. He then studied with Joseph Breuer, who had developed a cathartic method of therapy to treat hysteria. Using this method as a foundation of his theory of treating hysteria, Freud developed the free association method, which subsequently became one of the basic techniques of psychoanalysis. Arlo, 1979, Hall, 1954. Scientifically, approaching his work to discover underlying cause of behavior, he formulated the idea of unconscious forces. In the 1890s, he began a self-analysis of his own unconscious forces, and during this time he wrote The Interpretation of Dreams. This work contained his views on the dynamics of the mind as well as on dream interpretation. In 1901, he published The Psychopathology of Everyday Life, which proposed that slips of the tongue, errors, accidents, and faulty memory are the results of unconscious motives. In 1905, he published 3 other important works: A Case of Hysteria, which described the treatment of hysterical disorders, 3 essays on sexuality, which show the effects of sexual conflicts in producing neurosis, and wit and its relation to the unconscious, which proposed that much humor was a form of communicating hostility in covert terms. Francher, 1973. All of these works led to the psychoanalytic system of psychology. Fine, 1973. However, it was not Freud or his writings alone that made the psychoanalytic system become widespread. Equally important were the men who gravitated to him in what came to be known as the Vienna Circle. Otto Rank, Alfred Adler, Carl Jung, Carl Abraham, Max Eddington, Sandor Ferenczi, Hans Sachs, and Ernest Jones all started out as confederates and disciples of Freud, but later developed, extended, and reformulated Freud's theories, oftentimes in bitter disagreement with their mentor. In particular, Jung and Adler moved out and away from the pure psychoanalytics of Freud and developed their own theories and following. However, while these offshoots were seeking viable alternatives to Freud, the psychoanalytic movement continued to grow, often in bitter opposition to prevailing attitudes about psychology and treatment. Hale, 1971. In America, Freud became known after his initial visit. Prominent psychologists in America, such as Hall and William James, became receptive to the components of psychoanalytics. Abales, 1979. While Freud's ideas were taking root, he continued to refine the psychoanalytic system and the period from 1914 until his death in 1939 marked the extension of his ideas into an ego psychology that attempted an understanding of the total personality. Fine, 1973. Because of the Nazis' rise to power, numerous adherents of Freud left continental Europe and came to America in the 1930s. The result of this migration was that America became the strongest center for psychoanalysis in the world. Arlo, 1979. From the 1930s to the 1950s, a group of theorists and therapists such as Karen Horney, Erik Erikson, Harry Stack Sullivan, and Erich Fromm broadened basic Freudian psychoanalytics. These theorists, characterized as neo-Freudians, included cultural and social determiners and the development of interpersonal relationships as necessary extensions of the psychoanalytic view. Erikson, 1968, Fromm, 1955, 1956, Horney, 1939, and Sullivan, 1953. A number of contemporary psychoanalytically oriented therapists have developed innovative additions to Freudian and neo-Freudian formulations. Some of these are brief therapies that use creative or unusual ways of bypassing the conscious censor to uncover the client's emotional conflicts, self-image, and alternative coping strategies. Several examples are Shore, 1972-1980, Psycho-Imagination Therapy, Imagery, Rehearsal, Practice, Alliance, Encounter. Tien, 1969, Psychosynthesis, Will Training, Music Therapy, Suggestion, Sublimation, Meditation, Video Techniques, Videology, Medical Technology. Greenwald, 1973, Direct Decision Therapy, Goal-Directed Problem-Solving Practice, Homework, Self-Administered Rewards. Keston, 1980, Unconscious Negativism Strategy, Reflection of Unconscious Negativism. Langs, 1973, Supportive Intervention, Supportive and Confrontative Reality Reflection. Rees, 1972, Masked Time Therapy, Marathon Overwhelming of Defenses. Spotnitz, 1969, Modern Psychoanalysis, Therapist's involvement with client echoing the ego, devaluing the object, toxoid response to immunize clients against toxic introjections. Progoff, 1977, Intensive Journal Therapy, intensive journal keeping, process meditation, twilight imagery, journal feedback. Small, 1972. Alexander and French, 1946, brief therapy, rational dynamic techniques. Wahlberg, 1964, and Barnell, 1981, hypnoanalysis and hypnotherapy, hypnotic techniques, altered states of awareness. Pearson's, 1965, correspondence therapy, written communications, correspondence. The above list is only a beginning. Goldman and Millman, 1978, describe contemporary psychoanalysis as having many variations. The development and refinement of analytic concepts such as object relatedness, individualization and separation, self-development, and internal object presentation has evolved into a rapprochement among the various analytic approaches. Psychoanalytic psychotherapy is further described as a dynamic, growing, developing method of helping people solve psychological problems. While Freudian psychoanalytic thought not only influenced psychotherapy, but also literature, art, religion, social customs, education, and the social sciences, it was founded in an era that has long since passed from the scene. While contemporary psychoanalytic theorists adhere to the basic concepts laid down by Freud, they have gone far beyond the therapeutic couch and intellectual insight on the part of the client as sufficient for therapy. Contemporary theorists have expanded the therapy into a proactive, action-oriented approach which impels the client to think and act on the basis of acquired insight. Overview of Freudian psychoanalytic therapy. Freudian psychology has been identified under several names: psychoanalysis, psychoanalytic theory, psychodynamic therapy, psychodynamics, psychoanalytic psychotherapy, dynamic psychiatry, dynamic psychology, and depth psychology. Freudian psychology is a psychology of conflicting forces inherent in the dualistic nature of humankind. The conflicting dualism of the mind may be dichotomized into conscious and unconscious. The dualism of humans as they live in society may be dichotomized into the person as a biological animal and the person as a social being. Arlo, 1979. It is through conflicts of conscious versus unconscious and the biological motivating forces in people versus the social tempering forces in the environment that the personality develops. Acculturation occurs and values are required. Freud described this human motivation as governed by the tendency to seek pleasure, a biological drive, and to avoid pain. He called this tension-reducing force the pleasure principle. Arlo, 1979. Freud's conception of the development of neurosis grew from his studies of hysteria and hypnosis. In the course of these studies, he found that certain unacceptable events and thoughts people had consciously experienced were sometimes repressed from conscious awareness into an area of the mind he called the unconscious. These experiences, which were of a sexual nature, had direct influence on the person's behavior and were the cause of hysterical symptoms. These ideas were the basis of Freud's theory on the development of neurosis. Franscher, 1973. The methods of psychoanalysis also grew from the early studies of hysteria and hypnosis. Hypnosis was found to be a useful tool to relieve hysterical symptoms in some cases, but not all of Freud's clients responded equally well to hypnosis. He began to use an open-ended, gently guided discovery technique to bring to light childhood sexual fantasies. This technique evolved into the open-ended free association method, which is one of the cornerstones of classic psychoanalysis. The primary goal of this method is to make unconscious materials conscious and thereby promote insight and understanding. The method of interpretation is then applied to the unconscious material, similar to its application to the interpretation of dreams to facilitate the client's understanding of the influence of the unconscious motives on present behavior. Finally, the mechanism of transference and emotional attitude developed towards the therapist, representing a repetition of the individual's fantasies concerning a past relationship, such as with a parent, is utilized by the client to gain insight and to eventually resolve the neurotic conflict. Arlo, 1979, Goldman and Millman, 1975. Theory of personality. As proposed by Freud, the personality consists of a variety of concepts. Three major parts called the id, the ego, and the superego. Hall, 1954. Comprises the principal constructs. The id. The id exists at birth and is the source of psychic energy and the instincts, most important of which are sex and aggression. Energy in the id is in the mobile state and can be readily discharged through action and wish fulfillment. One function of the id is to fulfill the pleasure principle, a basic motivating factor that serves to reduce tension by seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. Arlo, 1979, Fine, 1973. The id is the newborn infant's reservoir of emotional energy. A basic function of the id is to maintain the organism in a state of tension-free comfort. When the infant is hungry, the id seeks immediate gratification to restore the infant to a state of comfort. Hansen, Stevish, and Warner, 1977. Frustration occurs when the infant does not get his or her oral erotic wishes immediately satisfied. The experience of overcoming early frustration operates to initiate learning, growth, and development. The exercise of the sucking instinct serves some important purpose. It satisfies the oral erotic needs of stimulation and satisfaction. Because of this, a cathexis develops between the infant's need for protection and the satisfaction and the mother's breasts or bottle. The infant's early experience of locking the mouth onto the nipple may serve as the first click or insight and thereby represents a taproot of all later learnings. Bilkin, 1980. Pages 56 to 57. Thus, the id is the energizer and starting point of the organism's personality. The ego. The ego is a complex psychological organization that acts as an intermediary between the id and the external world. It has both defensive and autonomous functions. It is not present at birth but is developed as the person interacts with the environment. To function as this intermediary, the ego operates by the reality principle. The reality principle postpones the discharge of energy until an object that will satisfy the need or reduce tension is found. Unlike the id, the ego is able to tolerate tension and thus delay gratification. The reality principle is served by the secondary process, which consists of discovering or producing reality through a plan developed by thought and reason. The second process interacts with the environment and develops the ego. These lines of development are also influenced by heredity and maturation processes. The ego has been called the executive of the personality because it controls and governs the id and the superego and maintains interaction with the external world. Fine, 1973, Hall, 1954. The superego. The superego is the moral, social, and judicial branch of the personality, representing the ideal rather than the real. The superego strives for perfection rather than pleasure or reality. It develops as a result of the need to control aggression that results when needs are not immediately satisfied. The superego develops from the ego by assimilating parental standards and eventually substitutes parental authority with its own inner authority. It takes over the governance of the psyche and acts as the mediator between the person and the environment. It acts as the moral and social gatekeeper and keeps the person's baser instinct from running rampant. Fine, 1973, Hall, 1954. There are two subsystems of the superego, the ego ideal and the conscience. The ego ideal is composed of the child's conceptions of what the parents consider to be perfection or the perfect person. These conceptions are established through experiencing parental acceptance. The conscience, on the other hand, is composed of the child's conception of what is considered to be morally bad and is established through experiencing admonitions, punishment, or lack of acceptance. Hall, 1954. In summary, the id is the reservoir of psychic energy that operates the three systems of personality. Since the id can only receive gratification through reflex and wish fulfillment, the ego gradually develops and rationally satisfies the impulses of the id through selecting objects in the environment that will reduce tension and bring pleasure. The ego eventually obtains control of most of the id's psychic energy. The superego serves as the moral arm of this personality structure by blocking discharge of energy through the prohibitions of conscience or directing the discharge of energy through the ego ideal. A person who is dominated by the id will tend to be impulsive. One who is dominated by the superego will tend to be overly moralistic and perfectionistic. The ego functions to keep the individual from these two extremes. Hansen, Stevish, and Warner, 1977. In a system where the ego is working well, the personality is a unified blend of the three subsystems. Hall, 1954.